I never planned to become the keeper of secrets in my own marriage, but that's what happened the moment I realized how carefully my husband curated his sobriety for everyone except me. From the outside, Ethan was a miracle story, the man who clawed his way out of addiction and then turned around to pull others with him, the sponsor who never missed a meeting, whose phone buzzed at all hours with desperate calls he always answered in that calm, practiced voice. From the inside, from where I stood barefoot in our kitchen at 6 in the morning, the air faintly sour with something that didn't belong, I knew something was wrong long before I had proof. It started with the empties, not obvious bottles tossed in the trash, but clever ones. Airline minis tucked behind paint cans in the garage, a flask slipped into the lining of a winter coat we hadn't worn in months, a bottle hidden inside the hollowed-out space of an old speaker in his office. Every discovery made my stomach tighten, not with shock, but with a slow, burning anger that came from realizing how intentional it all was. He wasn't slipping, he was living a double life, and the scariest part was how good he was at it. I told myself at first that I was mistaken, that stress could explain the smell on his breath some nights, that exhaustion could explain the glassy look in his eyes. But denial gets harder to maintain when you're the one scrubbing wine stains out of a sink he swore he never used. The morning I found the bottle taped to the underside of the bathroom cabinet, wrapped in a towel to muffle the clink, something in me shifted from fear to clarity. I didn't confront him, not then, because I understood instinctively that this wasn't a situation where shouting would save anyone. Instead, I started documenting, quietly, methodically, as if I were building a case for a future version of myself who might need proof just to remember she wasn't crazy. I took photos of every bottle where it lay before I moved it, time-stamped images of whiskey behind cereal boxes, vodka in the toolbox, rum inside a shoebox labeled tax documents. I noted dates, times, patterns, the way his drinking spiked after meetings where he'd been especially praised, especially thanked. Watching him stand in front of a room of vulnerable people, telling them how honesty saved his life, felt like a private betrayal layered on top of a public lie. The men he sponsored trusted him with their worst moments, their cravings, their shame, and he accepted that trust while hiding his own daily indulgence from them like it was a harmless hobby. At night, when he slept, I lay awake replaying conversations, realizing how often he'd gaslit me, how many times he'd laughed off my concerns as paranoia, how often he'd used his recovery story as a shield to deflect any question about his behavior. When I finally confronted him, it was late, the house quiet, one of those rare moments when his phone wasn't vibrating on the nightstand, and I laid the bottles out on the dining table like evidence in a trial. He didn't deny it, not outright, but minimized, reframed, insisted it was under control, that he never drank before meetings, that he was helping people, and that counted for something. Hearing him justify deception in the same breath as service was the moment I understood that he wasn't just lying to others, he was lying to himself, and that made him dangerous in a way I hadn't fully grasped before. I told him he needed to come clean, to his sponsor, to his group, to the men who looked at him like proof that change was possible, and he reacted with panic so sharp it bordered on rage, accusing me of trying to destroy him, of wanting to strip him of the only identity that made him worthwhile. That night, I slept on the couch, listening to him pace, and decided that if he wouldn't choose honesty, I would. The milestone celebration was scheduled weeks later, a carefully planned event marking his 5th year sober, complete with speeches, cake, and a room full of sponsees who believed they were honoring a man who had walked the path ahead of them. As the date approached, I kept documenting, not out of spite, but out of responsibility, because every day he continued sponsoring while drinking felt like another risk layered onto lives already hanging by threads. I didn't know exactly how the truth would come out, only that it had to, and that realization settled over me with a strange calm, the kind that comes when you stop trying to protect a lie that isn't yours to carry. The closer the celebration got, the more surreal our daily life became, like we were actors rehearsing for a scene only one of us believed in. Ethan practiced his speech in front of the bathroom mirror, timing pauses, testing the cadence of humility and gratitude, while I stood in the hallway listening, my chest tight with the weight of everything he wasn't saying. I watched him pick out the suit he wore only for anniversaries and milestones, smoothing the fabric with reverence, as if the clothes themselves were proof of his transformation. Meanwhile, I kept finding bottles, smaller now, more desperate, tucked into places that suggested panic rather than confidence. A half-empty one hidden in the tank of the guest toilet, another slipped behind the breaker panel in the basement. Each discovery reinforced that this wasn't a past problem resurfacing. It was an active deception accelerating under pressure. I stopped removing the bottles after photographing them and started cataloging them instead, lining them up in a storage bin in the garage, labeling each with the date and location, not because I enjoyed it, but because I needed a clear record of reality in a house that felt increasingly unreal. Ethan noticed my distance and misread it as support, mistaking my silence for loyalty, and that misunderstanding hurt more than his anger ever had. His sponsees started calling more frequently as the celebration approached, asking logistical questions, wanting to help decorate the community hall, thanking me for sharing Ethan with them, and each call felt like a small cut because they didn't know they were standing on a stage built on rot. One evening, a man named Caleb came over to drop off pamphlets, his hands shaking as he talked about how Ethan had saved his life, and I stood there nodding, thinking about the bottle of gin hidden in the freezer behind the frozen peas, wondering how many relapses were quietly being enabled by my husband's example. That night, I told Ethan again that this had to stop, that he couldn't stand up there and accept praise built on lies, and he snapped, telling me I didn't understand the responsibility he carried, that if people knew he was struggling, it would send them spiraling. The irony of him claiming to protect others by lying was almost too much to bear, and I realized then that he was more afraid of losing status than of harming the people he claimed to serve. I made my decision quietly after that, not in a moment of drama, but in the calm recognition that waiting for him to choose honesty was waiting for something that might never come. The night before the celebration, while Ethan slept, I gathered the bottles from the garage bin and placed them back where they'd been found, not to hide them, but to ensure the truth would be impossible to ignore when the time came. I set my phone alarms to remind me of dates and details, reviewed the photos one last time, and backed them up in multiple places, feeling less like a wife and more like a witness preparing to testify. At the hall the next day, the room buzzed with anticipation, decorated with banners celebrating milestones and resilience, and I helped arrange chairs, my hands steady despite the storm inside me. Ethan moved through the crowd like a hero, hugging people, accepting congratulations, his confidence rising with every word of praise. And I watched him carefully, noting the slight flush on his cheeks, the way his eyes darted when he thought no one was looking. When the cake was brought out and the room quieted for speeches, I felt a strange stillness settle over me, the kind that comes just before something irreversible happens. When Ethan stepped up to the microphone, applause filled the hall so completely it felt like pressure against my skin. And as he began to speak about gratitude and honesty and the gift of accountability, I felt the final piece click into place. The understanding that truth doesn't need theatrics, it only needs exposure. I stayed seated, hands folded, eyes forward, as he thanked his sponsees by name, each one nodding with pride, and when he reached the part of his speech about transparency, about living in the light, I saw Caleb shift in his chair, distracted by something at his feet. One of the bottles I had returned the night before had slipped from its hiding place beneath the folding table as people rearranged chairs, rolling just far enough to catch the eye of another man, then another, the small clink cutting through Ethan's words like a crack in glass. The room's attention fractured, whispers rippling outward as someone bent down and picked it up, recognition dawning not as accusation, but as confusion, and I watched Ethan falter mid-sentence, his confidence collapsing in real time. Caleb stood, holding the bottle with trembling hands, asking quietly if it was a mistake, if someone had brought it by accident, and when another sponsee stood with a second bottle found near the refreshment table, the truth assembled itself without my intervention. Ethan tried to explain, stumbling over excuses that contradicted each other, and that's when the men he sponsored began pulling out their phones, comparing notes, recalling moments that suddenly made sense, late-night calls that had sounded off, advice that rang hollow. I didn't have to say a word because the evidence surrounded him, not planted to frame him, but returned to where it had always been, his own secret life refusing to stay hidden. An older sponsor stepped forward and asked Ethan directly if he was drinking, not with anger, but with concern. And when Ethan finally nodded, the room went silent in a way that felt sacred rather than judgmental. The intervention happened organically, chairs pulled into a circle, the celebration dissolving into something real and urgent, and I watched as the men he'd misled confronted him with honesty they deserved from the start. I felt grief for them, for the trust broken, but also relief so profound it made me dizzy, because the lie was no longer mine to carry. When the group leader announced that Ethan would step down from sponsorship immediately and re-enter recovery as a participant, not a guide, no one protested, and the milestone cake sat untouched, its meaning erased by reality. Afterward, as people filtered out, some thanked me quietly for standing firm, for not protecting a false image at the expense of lives, and I drove home alone, knowing my marriage had changed irrevocably. In the weeks that followed, Ethan moved out to focus on his recovery, stripped of titles but faced with truth, and I began rebuilding a life grounded in integrity rather than performance. Looking back, I understand now that exposing his sham wasn't an act of betrayal, it was an act of responsibility. And standing in that hall, watching honesty finally take root, I learned that real support sometimes means refusing to lie alongside someone you love.
You've just stepped into her revenge side, where every wound finds its justice, and every silence ends with truth. If her story struck a chord, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. Another secret waits in the next video. See how her revenge begins.